Have any of you ever heard the saying, he met his Waterloo? What does that mean?
That was the battle that Napoleon lost, right?
It was the battle that Napoleon lost, but what does it mean, have you met your Waterloo? Or he met his Waterloo? Okay. Napoleon was soundly defeated by the British at Waterloo, and that was the end of his career, basically. He went into exile. And so ever since, that has meant, if you say somebody met their Waterloo, that means it's ended. They've had defeat. They've been finalized. Whenever you study anything, actually, you have to get the context or to get full meaning. What's context? Who you're talking to,
Who
who you're talking about, what's the historical situation. Well, when you're studying the Bible, context is vital. For example, in Revelation, it talks about the Battle of Armageddon. Most people don't realize that's not talking about a literal battle that's going to be fought. It's a reference to an Old Testament, primarily, times on the Valley of Esdraelon, in Israel north. There was this area, and Armageddon was called there were several battles fought in this region. They were decisive battles. And so when the Revelation writer uses the Battle of Armageddon, he's talking about a decisive battle between good and evil. If you read the book of, any book of the New Testament primarily, but if you read, say, the book of John, and I read it for years before I realized I was missing 2/3 of what the book was saying because I didn't understand the historical context. Every word in that book was written to combat a particular heresy. If you don't know that, you're going to miss half of what the book. First John, yeah. First John is written to combat the heresy of Gnosticism. And once you understand that, now it begins to make sense. The book of Hebrews, you've got to get the context or you're going to miss half of what it says. So we are studying, for the last 2 or 3 weeks, the geographical context of the Bible. A lot of times the Bible mentions things, and it's helpful to understand where and what, particularly around Jerusalem. Now, I gave everybody a map of Jerusalem. In 2 weeks, grades are going out, and next week we're having the final. So I just wanted you to know that. No, not seriously. But we're going to talk about the context of the Bible, the historical context, where things are, where things were. Particularly in Jerusalem, Jesus talks about going to the Mount of Olives, or he talks about going to the temple courts, or he talks about going to the upper city. Well, you might want to know where those things are. So when you read through the scriptures, then it makes more sense. I have found it to be very helpful to understand what Abraham went through, going from Ur the Chaldees up to Haran, down to Canaan. Why did he go that way? Well, there's reasons for those things. Tonight we're going to look at a map of the Exodus and see, that was a big deal to the Jews. And so we're going to look at some of those things and try to get a mental picture of where these things occur. So when you read about them in Scripture, you say, aha, that's what that's talking about. Why isn't... Oh. I was fixing to get on to you. You didn't do it this time. All right. So the Bible starts in this region. This is at the head of the Persian Gulf, which today you hear a lot about on the news. And Ur is the oldest known city on the planet. And this is where Abraham lived. And God told Abraham to move. Now, if you notice up here, this is Babylon. Babylon is right here on the river. And then Nineveh's up here. These are the major world empires of the days. And we talked about the Fertile Crescent. Thank you. In those days, you didn't travel straight across because that's several hundred miles of dry desert. So you went across this way around by the rivers. And this was a major trade route for ancient times. And that's why there were so many wars and battles fought This is why Nineveh and Persia and Babylon all became world powers, is because of this region. And then you got Egypt over here, which is the other major world power. And all those countries had a major impact upon Israel. Now, Israel's right along the coast here. In those days, it was known as Canaan. Canaan and Israel are the same. It became Israel later because Israel hadn't been born yet. So Abraham took off from Ur. He went up here to Haran. And then eventually God led him down into Canaan. And then he went down into Egypt and then back into Canaan. And that's where most of the Genesis account occurs, in Canaan. And then obviously that became Israel, and that's where most of the story occurs. Up here on the coast, you have the cities of the Philistines. The Philistines lived on the coast. You also had the Phoenicians. When you read about the Phoenicians, that's where they were, on the coast up here. And here's the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is mentioned many times in Scripture. And then up here's the Sea of Galilee. Jesus talked a lot about the Sea of Galilee. And we'll look at another map later and get a little more detail here. But this is the big picture of what's going on in the Old Testament Scriptures. Now, here's the Exodus. Now, the Israelites had been taken into Egypt. They lived in the land of Goshen. Now, most of Egypt, the land that you can live on, is just a narrow strip along the Nile River. Most of it's uninhabitable desert. But every year, the Nile River floods. It's the longest river in the world. And it's the only major river in the world that does what? It's the only major river in the world that does what?
It flows backwards.
It flows north. All the others go south. Okay? And so, every year, the Nile River floods. And it overfloods its banks and goes out for quite several hundred yards on either side. And it deposits very rich silt. And there's actually two sections of the Nile that's not on this map. But you've got the Red Nile and the Blue Nile in Central Africa. And when the snows melt, they flow together, making the Nile. And then in the summertime, or in the spring, they overflow. And that's where everything happens. Now, what happens if the snow does not fall?
You don't have a lot of rain, so you have a drought. Right?
Drought. And that's what happened in the 7 years Joseph, said that there's going to be 7 bad years. Well, the snow didn't fall in Central Africa, so the water didn't flow north. Now, when Israel came in, the Egyptians didn't want to live with them. Why?
Because they're shepherds.
They were shepherds, and the Egyptians, for one thing, they thought they were better than everybody else. And they didn't want to associate with those goat herders. And so they moved the Israelites up into the land of Goshen. Now, actually, that's one of the richer parts of the country because you have some delta region there, which is pretty good farmland. But most of the country is just along the Nile River. And like I said, except for a very narrow area, it's pretty much uninhabitable. So the Israelites lived in the land of Goshen. Another Pharaoh came to the throne who did not remember Joseph, and he put the Israelites into slavery. And then God sends Moses into Egypt to deliver the children of Israel. You remember that story. So when they left Egypt, they came over here and crossed the Red Sea, also known today as the Sea of Reeds. And this is where God parted the waters and they crossed. And so here is what scholars estimate might have been the path. We don't know for sure. The Bible doesn't really tell us indirectly. Now, the traditional position of Mount Sinai is down here in the Sinai Peninsula. But most scholars today believe it's actually over here. It doesn't really matter. But at any rate, the Israelites wandered in the desert for 40 years before they finally entered Canaan up here. It's not a very big area. I mean, you could walk it in a few days, but they wandered and wandered and wandered and wandered. Now, and there were a couple of million of them, yeah. All right, here's another view. Here's a little better view of the Nile River. And the pyramids are primarily up in this area. around Memphis. And a lot of these places are mentioned in Scripture. And now, the Israelites did not go the short way. They could have walked to Canaan in 2 or 3 weeks. But God didn't take them that way. That's known as the way of the way of the Philistines. And God knew that if they went that way, they would have to fight their way every foot of the way. There were lots of nations along that route. And God knew they weren't ready for warfare yet. And so he led them down. Plus, he wanted to take them to the Mount Sinai and give them the law and so forth. But this would have been the shortcut. All right, so now in the days of Jesus, and this is important for us to learn, Israel was divided into primarily 3 major sections. Judea, you have Jerusalem in this area. This is where the traditional Jews lived. And then you have, in this area, you have Samaria. This is where the Samaritans lived. Now, Samaria got its start back during the United Kingdom period. And then in the divided kingdom, Samaria became the capital of the northern kingdom. Jerusalem was the capital of the southern kingdom. And then when the Assyrians came in 722 BC, they destroyed Samaria and they carried off the Jews into captivity. And then they also brought in a lot of foreigners and mixed them in with the Samaritans. And by the time of Christ, after several hundred years of all these people living together, what happened? They intermarried and the cultures merged. And so the Samaritans were considered half-breeds by the Jews living in Judea. And then north of Samaria is Galilee. This land is the richest land in the area. It gets plenty of rain. Judea averages 10 inches of rain a year. How much do you need to produce a crop? 10 inches. Well, if you average 10, what does that mean? Some years you don't get that much. So it's hard to grow crops in Judea. So Judea was not good for growing crops, but it was great for growing cows and goats and sheep and so forth. So it primarily became a herdsman type. You got a lot of hills, and it's really prime land for growing sheep and goats and so forth. Okay, so you've got Judea here, Samaria in the middle, Galilee up here. Now, the Samaritans and the Jews didn't like each other. Back when the Jews came back from Babylonian captivity in 535 BC, the Samaritans came down and offered to help them rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. And the Jews said, no, we don't want your help. So that made everybody real happy. And so for the next several hundred years, there was hatred fostered between the Jews and the Samaritans. So that's why there's so much talked about in Jesus' day about the Samaritans. And when Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan, how would the Jews have taken that? What are you talking about? There's no such thing as a Good Samaritan. The Jews hated the Samaritans, and the Samaritans hated the Jews. And so with the fact that the Samaritan, he didn't tell it the other way. He didn't tell it a Jew helped the Samaritan. He said the Samaritan helped the Jew. And so that creates all kinds of havoc. Now over here is what's called the Decapolis. This is on the east side of the Jordan River. There are a lot of Gentiles over here, several Jews mixed in, but a lot of Gentiles. The Decapolis means the 10 cities. There were 10 different cities in this region. Quite a bit in the Gospels occurs in the Decapolis. And then you got the Sea of Galilee and so forth. So Jesus spent most of his time up here in his ministry. He didn't spend time much down here. Why not? Because his enemies, the Jewish leaders wanted to kill him. So he spent most of his 3 years ministry up in Galilee, going from town to town and so forth. Okay, you got the Sea of Galilee here, and then you got the Jordan River going down this way into the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea, I've been there, the most beautiful water in the world. beautiful blue water, and stinks like rotten eggs. What's unusual about the Dead Sea? For one thing, it's the only major body of water below sea level. What else about it is odd?
No life.
Sir?
There's no life
There's no light. Why?
because of the salt content.
Okay. The Dead Sea has no outlet. All the water that flows in has to stay there unless it does what? Evaporates. So that's how it keeps not from overflowing. So what happens to anything in the water? It stays. And so all the water over the centuries that flowed into the Dead Sea, carrying even minute amounts of salt, that salt builds up. The Dead Sea is so thick. I stood there on the bank and watched the water roll in. It's just like molasses. It's just so thick. You could practically walk on this stuff. It's so thick. I mean, it's like syrup. You can sit in it. If you sit up, you can get your hands and feet and just have your bottom in the water because you float. It's that thick of water. And like I said, it stinks to high heaven. Birds will not fly over it. Nothing grows around it. It's really the Dead Sea.
All the fish that come down the river are freshwater fish, and they go in that saltwater body. They can't live there.
Yeah, they can't live there. Right, right. And naturally, the Jews and the Arabs have been fussing about the water. They fuss about everything. Why not the water too? So this is the way it was in the days of Jesus. When Jesus was alive, you had these three major divisions of the country. Now, Jesus was born or lived up here in Nazareth. Nazareth is up in the mountains. It's kind of isolated from the rest of the country. And so when Jesus would say, "I'm from Nazareth," what would the average Jew say? Yeah, nothing good ever came out of Nazareth. It was considered a backward, part of the country.
Steve, do you think that's coincidence that Jesus spent most of his time where the soil was fertile, so to speak?
No, it's not accidental at all.
Right?
No. Yeah, that was prime. Yeah, he got a lot of converts up there because those were people who were willing to listen. If he'd gone down in here in this section, he'd have been fought every inch of the way.
Is it me, or it seems like the modern day West Bank is around where Samaria is there, the east side of Samaria, and goes down. Or is it just, maybe I've got the scale wrong here. This seems like Jerusalem is too far south on this map. Has it moved?
Well, that is a problem when you come to scale, but yeah, the West Bank would actually be further south in this area. Yeah. Of course, then you've got Gaza right here, and that's where all the fighting's going on right now in Gaza City. And this region is the Gaza Strip. All right, let's look at the map of the Jerusalem. Lots of stuff went on in Jerusalem, and I want you to get a feeling for the city. Now, this area here, just this area right here, was known as the city of David. When David came along, that was all the city there was. The rest of the city was not there. Just this area right here along the hill. And then over time, they began to build the rest of it. And then in the day of Solomon, he built the temple up here on Mount Gerizim. So right in this area, we have the temple structure. And then the walls were built around the city. Now, in Scripture, you read about the upper city. This area here is the upper city. This is where the wealthy people lived. This is where the high priest and his crowd lives. This area is known as the lower city. Now, you can't tell it real well from the map, but right along here, there's a big valley, the Tyropian Valley. And then the Temple Mount has the temple built on it. The Temple Mount itself is a lot bigger. And then the way the people got from the majority of the city, up into the temple, was called Robinson's Arch. An archaeologist a couple hundred years ago found it, and they named it after him. So there was a huge walkway up into the city. Surrounding the Temple Mount were mikveh baths. The archaeologists have found dozens of them. They're just cisterns they dug in the ground. And before a Jew could go up on the Temple Mount to worship, he had to take a bath. That proved that he was ceremonially clean before his God. He was given a little token, and he had to carry that with him. And then they would check him, make sure he had the right to be on the Temple Mount. The temple itself, you've got the building here in the middle, but it was surrounded by 3 courts. You had the courtyard of the Jews first. This is where the sacrificial altar was. This is where you carried your animals in, and the priest would cut the throat of the animal, put the blood on the altar, and then burn up the interior and the insides of the animal. They didn't burn up the meat, they burned up the organs. And then the meat, most of it was given back to the family, and they would hold a feast to God. And then the priest would always get their share of all the sacrifices. That's how they got part of their support, was from the sacrifices that were offered. Around the temple, around the courtyard of the Jews, was the courtyard of the women. Any Jew could go into the courtyard of the women. Now, the women couldn't go into the courtyard of the men, but any Jew could go into the courtyard of the women. And then there was a third courtyard around that, this major area here, and this is the courtyard of the Gentiles, and anybody could go into that area. From the courtyard of the women to the courtyard of the Gentiles, there were several gates. Archaeologists have found signs from the days of Christ that say any Gentile that crosses into this courtyard dies. That's exactly what they got Paul arrested on. His enemies accused him of carrying he had a Gentile traveling with him, and they accused him of carrying this Gentile into the temple courts. Well, he didn't, but they accused him of that, and that's actually what they got him on, was a false charge.
Well, I hope you could read the language. You're Gentile, you know.
Yeah.
If you can,
Well, yeah.
Just kind of walk
Yeah,
there.
yeah. The day that I was at now, this wall here, back here, that's the Wailing Wall today. That's the only part of the structure still standing, this wall along this side. It's still there. The day I was there, they had a wedding. The only day that a man could go on, now the wall is now divided in the men's section and the women's section. The only day in his life that a man can go into the women's section is on his wedding day. And so while we were there, we watched the bride and groom walk into the section and go up to the wall itself. If you've ever seen pictures on the news, Herod is the one who rebuilt that wall. And Herod's architecture had a very unique signature. Every block that Herod's architects built into the wall had what's called a margin around it. And it's very recognizable. And there were cracks between the blocks. And every Jews today, when they go to the Wailing Wall, they will write out their prayer requests and stick them into the cracks. And I thought it was also cool. I saw a lot of Jewish men going to their side, and they would hold their prayer book in their hand. They'd put their hand on the Wailing Wall and do this. And I said, why in the world are they doing that? And it was explained to me that a Jew believes that when you worship God, you don't just worship Him with your mouth or your heart, you worship Him with your whole body. I thought, well, that's pretty cool. So they get their whole body involved in worshiping God. And so that's along this wall here. That's the only part of the original temple structure still standing. Now, on this side of the Temple Mount is the Kidron Valley. There is a creek running all the way down. A creek? Is that good word? Huh? Stream, that was where I was looking. Yeah. And during the festivals, there were so many sacrifices offered, the blood running off the temple. They even had a sophisticated drainage system off the Temple Mount. Because when you're killing, they kill 250,000 animals in 1 week. That's a lot of blood.
Peter would not be happy.
And the blood would drain off the Temple Mount into the Kidron Valley. And the water would turn red for the whole week.
With the Red Sea.
No. Good guess. Now, down here on the south, below the city, on the south side of the city, is the Valley of Hinnom. This was the garbage dump for the city. All the garbage of the city would go to the Valley of Hinnom. They would throw it in and set it on fire. And guess what they used that as an example of? Hell. Hell was called Gehenna, the Valley of Hinnom. And so Jesus and some of the other apostles would sometimes refer to hell. Now the word hell is translated from 3 different words in the Bible. One word means simply the grave, Hades. One word is talking about the waiting place. When you leave this earth, you go to, you remember the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man went to, no, the poor man went to paradise. The rich man went to torment. But the word there is Tartarus. You may have heard that in other movies. And then Gehenna was considered eternal hell, but that came from the idea of the garbage dump. And naturally, in a garbage dump, you've got smoke going up 24/7. And what else would you have in a garbage dump? Smelly, rats, bugs, you know. And so that was the image of hell. It's a horrible idea. Now, up here on the north side of the Temple Mount. Now remember, in those days, cities were built with the idea of defense in mind. And so you had 3 different walls built on the north side because any invasion of the city would have to come from the north, because they couldn't cross the valleys to get to the city from any other direction. So all the invasion routes were from the north. So they would build 3 different walls. And the Romans came along and built a fortress on the north corner of the Temple Mount. This was called Fortress Antonia. When the Bible refers to Jesus being taken to trial, that's where he was taken. There's a fortress on this northern corner. That's where Pilate had his headquarters. Whenever he was in town, that's where he set up shop. Now the Jews always kept a very small garrison in town. Now the Romans kept a very small garrison in town to keep order. But during the festivals, a larger contingent of Roman soldiers would come from the area of Galilee. They had a city up there, Caesarea, where their large army of Romans was stationed. And they would come to town, and Pilate would bring them, and they would be stationed in the fortress and then throughout the city. Now, here's the Pool of Siloam. And this was interesting as well. During the time of Hezekiah, he ordered that a tunnel be built, because at that time the Pool of Siloam was outside the city walls. Well, that's one of the major sources of fresh water for the city. So if the enemy comes along, what do they have to do? Just surround the pool and you surrender. So Hezekiah ordered them to dig a tunnel from the Pool of Siloam back up into the city itself. And I got to go through that tunnel. That was so cool. And what's really weird about it, I mean, we're talking about technology that was, 500 years before Christ. They started at both ends and met in the middle. Can you imagine how tough that would be? Woo!
They were only off by a little bit.
And they were only off by a few feet, yeah. So it was amazing. But when we were walking through the tunnel, it was so narrow. When we meet somebody coming the other way, because they had this end closed, they didn't tell us that. But when we got halfway through and we met a crowd coming the other way, we had to find niches in the wall to back up into so people could get by. But the history of this place is just fascinating. Now, over here in this part of the city is where the high priest lived and his cronies. The wealthy folks lived in the upper city. And then you had the lower city where more of the poor folks lived and so forth. Now, up here in this area is considered where Jesus was crucified. On the north side of the wall, it is believed, now we're not absolutely certain, but we're believed that this is where Jesus was crucified and buried. Now over here, on this side of the city, is the Mount of Olives. So the night Jesus died, or the night before he died, Jesus started off in the upper city. That's just where they found a house to have Passover in. And this is where he had his Last Supper with his apostles. They crossed the Tyropian Valley, and they exited one of the gates on this side of the city. And then they went on the Mount of Olives, and that's where he was arrested. And then he was carried back to this part of the city for first trial, second trial, third trial. And then eventually they carried him over to the north side of the Temple Mount to Pilate. And that's where he was. And then he had to carry his cross all the way through the city back to the hill where he was crucified. Yes?
So, upper city there, I'm guessing, it looks like from this, it kind of looks like it's the geographically, it's higher
Oh yeah,
than
oh
the
yeah.
rest. That's
Like I
why-
said, this is a valley here, a deep valley. This is Tyropian Valley, and then you go straight uphill to the upper city. Yeah, it doesn't come out quite as easy on the map.
And obviously, I guess you got to cross the Kidron Stream over there every
Yeah.
time you go to the Mount of Olives.
Yeah,
So-
yeah. The Kidron stream wasn't very wide, so you could walk across it. Let's see. Now, when we were on the Mount of Olives, we had church on the mountain. That was one of the coolest things I've ever done in my life. We had church services on the Mount of Olives one Sunday morning, and sitting there on the Mount of Olives, looking across into the city itself. I mean, that was so cool to think Jesus Christ walked over there, and we had worship services. That was really cool. That's where I got That's where I got drunk the first time. Not really. When they handed out the communion, it was real wine. I didn't know it. And I took a big slug of real, man, that burned all the way down. I also got stoned in the city, by the way. I tell people that. What? Some kids threw rocks at us. So I got stoned in Jerusalem. My name is Stephen, that's right. That's right. I don't know why those kids were throwing rocks at us, but that was mean. Yeah. The Romans also built the hippodrome. Anybody know what that is?
It's where they keep hippos.
It's a horse racing track.
It's close.
Now today, instead of the temple, is the Dome of the Rock. That's the second most holy place in the world to an Arab. They believe that Muhammad left the earth from a big rock there. And so they built the Dome of the Rock over that rock. And so that's what's happened. Of course, if the Jews were to tear that down, that would be the one thing that would unite every Arab in the universe against them. So they can't tear it down. They'd love to so they could rebuild the temple, but they can't because the Dome of the Rock is sitting there.
In fact, the Arabs tore down their temple, didn't unite the Jews against the Arabs, I guess.
Well, the Arabs didn't tear it down. That was done by the Babylonians. And then in the day of Jesus, it was done by the Romans. In AD 70, the Romans came in and destroyed this temple to do away with Judaism. God used the Romans to wipe out Judaism because once the temple was gone and the records are gone, the Jews cannot restart Jewish worship. So there's no such thing as Jewish religion today from the Old Testament standard. One other interesting thing, the Golden Gate is on this side of the city. And this was the gate that was prophesied in the old scriptures that the Messiah would return through. So guess what the Arabs did?
Part of
For one thing, they bricked it up as if that would keep the Son of God out. And then they put a graveyard in front of it. Because Scripture says that the prophet, who was also a priest, would precede the Messiah. Well, the priest can't go through a graveyard. Why?
It's unclean.
It's unclean. Priests are not allowed to go through graveyards. And so I thought, well, if we put a graveyard there, Jesus can't come back. So and then on the spot traditionally viewed as the birth, the death, the tomb of Jesus, they put a bus station. They do everything to irritate each other. I mean, the Jews irritate the Arabs irritate the Jews, and no wonder they love each other so much.
Steve,
Yes.
up there where the temple's at, Herod's Temple, that upper building there,
Yeah.
that wall that's on the out, that surrounds it there, how high is that thing?
Okay. Well, this is what's called the pinnacle of the temple. This corner is about 200 feet down to the Kidron Valley. So when Satan said, if you'll jump off the wall, Jesus... Matter of fact, one guy tried that. Guess what happened?
Nothing good.
He wasn't the Messiah after all. They scraped him off the pavement. But Satan says, since you are the Son of God, if you'll do it, everybody will believe. And you won't have to go through all this hassle. If you'll just jump off the Temple Mount, the Temple Pentacle, is what the Scriptures call it, then you'll fall all the way down into the Kidron Valley, and that's a 200-foot drop, and everybody will believe you're the Messiah.
So that structure's still there.
This part is the only part still standing.
But the Romans didn't tear down all that, they just...
The Romans tore it down. Now, some of the Crusaders, several hundred years later, came back and rebuilt a lot of stuff. A lot of the stuff now you see on TV is Crusader construction.
Well, what did the Romans actually tear down completely?
The Romans tore down the entire temple area. They tore down the temple itself. They leveled it. They tore down all the walls. They leveled the whole city and burned it.
That was what I was wondering. So the Wailing Wall was actually not there when the Romans were there. It was built after? Is that right?
No, the
Rebuilt?
Wailing Wall, they didn't destroy the Wailing Wall. They covered it up with rubble.
Okay.
So later on, when the Crusaders and everybody came in, they uncovered it. And that's the only part of the wall left is about 40 feet high and about 150 feet long. It's just a small section back here. This is where the Wailing Wall is today.
What was the original height?
I don't remember. I'd have to look it up. But it was probably 50 or 100 feet high anyway. Well, our time is up. We'll see you next time.